responsible for our foreign policy relations and hence how other EU member states conduct their foreign policy. So the work in the E3 on Iran, for example, European approach to Russia, China, that is Foreign Secretary's responsibility. Resourcing and priorities of the relationship with the EU is obviously for the FCDO, and there are a number of Foreign Office specific leads which are, for example, overseas territories, Gibraltar, development issues, which fall to him. My role sort of complements that. The thought behind it, I suppose, is that the TCA is so wide-ranging that the task of implementing and working to implement the TCA necessarily takes up a lot of day-to-day business with EU member states as well. So my job is to sort of make sure that all our interests with respect to a particular member state are taken into account, properly ranked, properly sort of worked through, and we try and look at everything in the round. And my interlocutors reflecting that are the Europe leads in Prime Minister's office, Europe ministers, and so on. So that is a sort of what we feel is a natural division, and it works in practice. But obviously, it does require us to work closely together day to day to make it work.
May I ask, when you were in the Foreign Service, where you had an illustrious career for many years, would you not have imagined that the Europe Minister should be a Foreign Office Minister?
So I think there are a number of different ways one could structure these things. I think the practice that's emerged over the years across Europe is that European business tends to be done sort of centrally and with a central role for the head of government and the people around him, and that's the way we've structured it here for now. There are obviously different ways of doing it, but at the moment we're focusing on making this one work.
Okay, can I ask then, Mr. Appleby, who do you work to?
So the whole of the UK mission to the EU, along with every other post in the FCO network, of course, is directly accountable to the Foreign Secretary for all of our work. Within that, there are a whole range of ministers who have a direct interest in parts of our EU work, and different parts of my team and I work to different ministers on different issues.
Does any minister come close to approaching the amount of spectrum that Lord Frost takes up?
The Foreign Secretary, as well as having overall responsibility for the mission and the resourcing of the mission, the foreign policy and relationships with individual member states for that foreign policy, that takes up a very significant chunk of the work that the UK mission does. So I would say that the ministerial teams within which I'm in most contact are the FCO ministerial team, both Wendy Morton and the Foreign Secretary, and Lord Frost and his team.
And how do you balance, Lord Frost, between the relationship you need to have through Mr. Appleby and the relationship you need to have through our bilateral relationships in EU capitals?
So I think we balance it according to the demands of business. We have obviously a lot of what I do day to day is policy making on and interaction with the Commission and their teams and the people who are essentially running their side of implementation of the TCA and the withdrawal agreement. That's a big chunk of what I do. Obviously, I talk to Europe ministers or approximate equivalents round the rest of the EU as well, and some of those relationships loom larger than others. Obviously, we've got a particularly large amount of business with France in different ways at the moment, so that occupies a fair amount of my time, but I'm sure these things will vary as events vary.
And when you task embassies around the diplomatic network, do you task them directly or do you task them through the Europe Minister if they're in Europe?
So I task directly. That is understood and agreed. And embassies can report directly to me or to the FCDO according to what the substance is. And
now, I heard your... Sorry, forgive me for interrupting.
No, carry on.
I heard your answer at the beginning when we asked you whether you were the Europe Minister, and you said yes and no. I'm finding it hard to see in what way you are not at the moment.
So I think, partly because I do have other responsibilities, and some.
Oh, I see. So you're Europe Minister plus.
It's part of my time, but I do think, as Lindsay was saying, in practice, now we've left the EU, a very significant part of our business with EU member states is on foreign policy in different ways, relation with the rest of the world, and that is the Foreign Secretary's responsibility. So in that sense, there's a big chunk which I do not lead on, but obviously take an interest in, just as he does in what I'm doing.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, just one last point. We heard earlier this year about the accreditation or lack of accreditation of the EU ambassador to the United Kingdom, and now the ambassador has been accredited, and I believe, Mr. Appleby, your contacts have opened finally. What was the practical benefit of delaying that?
So I think this was always a little bit kind of over-interpreted, possibly in public debate. I think our wish always was to find a way of ensuring that the EU delegation in London was able to do its business in a normal diplomatic way, and we've now reached agreement on that, as you say, and it'll be taken forward. We did have some discussions with the EU about this last year. So it was a slightly surprising to us that it sort of blew up as an issue, but we were never seeking to kind of squeeze out the delegation or treat them as a non-diplomatic mission or anything like that. We just wanted to find the right basis, and that's what happened.
And how does the basis under which they're now treated, as you say, the basis that they now accept, how does that differ from their initial request?
So I think I wouldn't want to go into details on that at this point while we're still sort of working through the final stages of accreditation and the process. But I think we are both confident that we have found the right balance of interests for us both to do our jobs effectively.
Thank you very much. Chris Bryant, you wanted to come in.
Thanks very much, and good morning. It seems to me you've basically described your job as the job that I did as Minister of Europe 11 years ago in the Foreign Office. The only difference being that there was better coordination with common foreign and defence policy in Europe.
So I'm trying to remember whether I was in the Foreign Office. I think it was very, very briefly while you were doing that role. And as I said, I think there are different ways of organising these things. And although I think the way we've done it is the norm, as it were, across Europe, you can point to countries that do things in a different way. And wherever you do it, you have a coordination problem of some kind, and it really rests on those involved to make it work as best they can. I think we are making it work. So I'm not sure I would say we were better coordinated in 2010 than now. I think the situation is just so different that it's difficult to make that comparison.
It feels terribly opaque, but you're right, of course, that you just have to cut it some way or other. And Downing Street, the head of government, is bound to play a vital part in any kind of foreign policy, and that relationship between the Foreign Office and head of government is bound to be essential. The question is, whose responsibility is it when something goes wrong, I guess? So let me just take you to one area where a lot of people think that we're in a bit of a bad state now, which is British performing artists being able to travel and perform elsewhere in Europe. Whose responsibility is that to sort that out now?
So it's a good example actually of the question. Obviously, I led the negotiation that took us to this point and agreed the treaty. Without going into the history, obviously we put forward proposals that we believe would have dealt with this problem, but they couldn't be agreed, and so be it. We are where we are now, in accordance with the principle I set out at the start. In terms of implementing the TCA, which is extremely broad, it's for each Whitehall department to take forward the work that relates to it. So in this case, DCMS have the lead responsibility. They're working very closely with the FCO through the embassies in lobbying governments to see if they're willing to sort of change their visa processes where they're complicated. But this is a DCMS lead. My responsibility is to make sure that, for example, if we are lobbying country X, that ask of country X is sort of seen in the context of everything else we want from country X or anything else they want from us, and to try and maximize the trade-offs there.
How on earth do we end up here? Because, you know, cultural assets, music, theatre, art, are a really vital part of Britain's economy, our exports within Europe. They are a vital part of our soft diplomacy as well, I would argue. And yet your line is, well, so be it. It does really feel as if this industry, which is a massive earner for the UK, has rather been sort of left to one side. And there seems to be no urgency about solving it.
So I think there is quite a lot of urgency, and embassies have been talking to their host governments. I know ministers in DCMS have been engaged on this. But I think the clearest example, this illustration of the fact that we could have ended up somewhere else, is the fact that in our negotiation with EFTA, with Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, we have agreed something better. We put forward something better, and those countries were willing to agree to it. So we shouldn't be facing the same problems for those countries. Unfortunately, the EU would not agree to that solution, and that's where we are. So that's why I say, so be it. We would much rather be in a better position, but it takes two to agree a constructive outcome, and unfortunately, we're not there.
So what prospect do you think there is in the short to medium term, i.e. this year, for instance, of resolving any of these issues for performing artists?
So as I think the Secretary of State for Culture said last month or thereabouts, you know, we reckon something like 17 of the 27 have a regime that is pretty relaxed for such touring artists. I mean, ours is pretty relaxed, indeed amongst the most relaxed, but there are 10 or so where the rules are more complicated, and that is where we are focusing our efforts to see if we can improve access in some of those areas. But obviously we're in the hands.
And they're the big ones, aren't they?
The member states concerned. I don't have the list with me, I fear. I think there are big countries in both the 17 and the 10.
Seems a bit odd not to have that list. But let me ask you another question in this similar field, which is about the EU is now saying that it is going to determine under its quota system for broadcast that British material made in Britain doesn't count for the EU quota system. Now, I'm not a particular fan of cultural quotas myself, always been opposed to them, but nonetheless, this is going to cut British broadcasting out of sales across Europe, isn't it?
So, I mean, I've only seen the media reporting of this. They obviously were aware of discussions amongst 27. As I understand it, all that's happened is that a questionnaire gone round asking for views on this question. So there, in terms of EU policy, there's a long way to go yet on this. We're not in favour of that. We're in favour of free circulation of audiovisual goods as of other goods. But obviously, if the EU choose to sort of harm themselves and their viewers by excluding some categories of UK content, we can't stop them. But we believe that I'm sure good sense will prevail and we won't be in that position.
But it might suggest, I mean, I agree with you about quotas, but it might suggest that it wasn't all that good a deal that was originally signed.
It's a traditional position of France which takes some shaking that audiovisual arrangements are not part of free trade agreements. And although we started off with a more expansive position, I don't think there was ever any realistic chance coming out of this negotiation in a different place.
And let me just ask one final question, which is about, and I apologise that I have to leave, I have to go and see the Leader of the House about something. But can I just ask about sort of bilateral relations between the UK and individual countries? Because in the end, quite often delivering a result on any particular subject in the EU relies on obviously getting key figures within each of the individual member states to help. And that applies to, shared foreign policy on sanctions or whatever, as well as on things that matter to us on trade. This does not directly affect me, but I gather that Sweden has a deal with Canada over access for au pairs. Now, is that the kind of arrangement that the UK is going to have to be pursuing one by one with each of the individual countries? And how do you see the resources that are going to be necessary to be able to deliver those good outcomes for the UK?
So I think there are obviously two different questions in there. One, obviously it remains a very significant part of this government's responsibility and my role to maintain influencing networks with the member states on all kinds of issues. Obviously the context for it has changed in that we, whatever the EU decides, we are not subject to legally. That changes the context of what needs to be achieved. But obviously it influences us and has an effect on us, and we need to maintain those relationships. And that's a very important part of what we do, of what Lindsay does in Brussels, what the embassies do, and so on. So we aim to keep that up, and indeed do more, because as there are no longer quite so many meetings in Brussels that we go to, we need to find ways of meeting and staying in contact with people in other ways. So that's definitely a big part of what we do. The question on Sweden's agreement with Canada, obviously I don't know the detail of that, but by and large, issues about work visas and working arrangements are still within the competence of the member states. So it doesn't surprise me that that's the case. And just as it now is in our competence to control our immigration arrangements and who comes here to work. So that is within our power, and it's something I'm sure the Home Secretary or Home Office ministers would be happy to talk further about, in accordance with my principle that departments take forward the work that falls to them under the agreements.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Royston, did you want to come in on the back of this, or do you want to wait? Okay.
I think I'll wait until after Graham's, if I may, Chair.
Okay. Graham, over to you.
Morning, Minister. The Prime Minister has said repeatedly that the Northern Ireland Protocol shouldn't impact on the indivisibility of the United Kingdom. It clearly has. What went wrong?
So obviously I've said a certain amount on this at the Northern Ireland Select Committee last week, but happy to repeat the salient points here. I think, what we did with the Northern Ireland Protocol was something pretty exceptional. it was a big compromise to protect the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, and the exceptional thing was to control goods moving within our own country in that interest, and to apply EU law in parts of our own country. If those arrangements are going to be sustainable, they have to operate in a pragmatic and proportionate way, and that's not what's happening. The delicate balance in the Good Friday Agreement, risks being unsettled. We are implementing the protocol as best we can and spending a lot of money on it, but there are still big problems, and this is creating a sense of difficulty for identity in Northern Ireland. We're trying to find solutions. We put forward lots of solutions, but at the moment there isn't a huge amount of engagement on all of them, but we keep trying, and that is the situation at the moment.
You mentioned the Northern Ireland Committee last week. You told them that the way the protocol is being implemented is not consistent with your intentions. I think that's quite clear, actually. But what are the big differences between how you expected it to work and how it does work?
So I think the basic problem, I mean, we're sort of learning from experience, I think, a bit here. The basic problem is that the chilling effect on goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland is pretty strong. And I think until we actually began implementing the protocol, nobody could quite know that. The protocol says that we should all, both parties, make efforts, best endeavours to reduce checks in Northern Ireland, checks and processes in Northern Ireland to the minimum, and we're not convinced that is what's happening. So what we would want to see is a kind of more pragmatic approach from the EU. If their approach is simply to say you must just implement the EU customs code as if this were any other external frontier of the EU, then we obviously have a problem. There has to be more pragmatism and reasonableness than that about goods that never leaves the UK customs territory.
Before the protocol was agreed, what assessment did the government, or did you make, on the impact of the constitutional position of Northern Ireland, and in particular, how it seems to conflict with the 1800 Acts or Act of Union?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I don't think it's for me now to comment on the internal processes of the government and the legal advice of that time in the usual way, and I think all the more so because obviously there is a court case in being which touches on some of those issues, but obviously the protocol is embodied in the EU Withdrawal Act that received full parliamentary approval, and those issues I think were debated at the time. So I think that's probably all I can say on that issue, given the wider context here.
My final question, if I may. The outgoing leader of the DUP, Edwin Poots, has said that he expects a significant change to the benefit of Northern Ireland in the immediate future, although most of the press are reporting that negotiations are frozen and stuck. Did Edwin Poots, was he right to have that expectation?
So, I mean, obviously I can't comment on sort of private conversations and accounts of them, but I think we haven't made a secret of the fact that we find it hard to see how, as currently operated, important elements of the protocol are sustainable. So I don't think that's kind of new judgment. We've also said that we are considering all our options, and we are doing so. there is a real world timetable to things that needs to be taken into account when we do that. So that's sort of where we are at the moment, where we're actively considering the options to deal with the situation that is it's hard to see as sustainable. I would just pick up one comment you made on negotiations, because I said earlier that I think in many areas negotiations there wasn't a lot of traction. That's not true of absolutely every area, and we are having lots of technical discussions with the Commission. We have put in our proposal to extend the grace period on chilled meats, which expires very soon, and I know both sides are thinking very actively about that. So I wouldn't want to leave the impression that nothing is happening. Quite a lot is happening. In one or two areas there's engagement, and in other areas it's more difficult.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Lord Frost, can I just pick up on 2 points you made there? One is you said that no one could have predicted the chilling effect on GB to Northern Ireland trade. I seem to remember that the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium wrote about this at the time, warning that people who weren't versed in the protocol would probably be averse to the form filling and raising concerns about it. I also, pretty sure I read in the reports from Britain in a Changing Europe by Anand Menon that this was predicted. And more recently, Lord Barwell has given various interviews in which he has stated that this was exactly the reason why the former Prime Minister went for a different arrangement. Are you sure they weren't predicted?
So I'm not saying that nobody suggested that such a thing could happen. I think what we've seen, though, is that the effect has been pretty marked, and actually one of the things that's been pretty marked, not just on GBNI movements, but in other areas of trade in and around Northern Ireland, is how rapidly companies have responded to the different incentives and the different possibilities for moving goods, and that has happened pretty rapidly. I think the other point I would make was that when we agreed the protocol in 2019, obviously a lot of these matters remain to be worked out. The whole concept of goods at risk was not properly worked through and was explicitly left until later. And we had been working on the assumption that we would secure things in those negotiations in 2020 on implementation of the protocol that would be part of a pragmatic implementation, and that we would also secure things in the TCA that it turned out we couldn't. For example, we asked for an equivalence mechanism on agri-food, that wasn't granted. We asked for cooperation amongst regulators, which is a normal part of FTAs, that wasn't granted. So it turned out we're operating in rather a different sort of framework by the end of 2020 than the one we probably had in mind in 2019.
May I just ask on that basis, what was it about the negotiations since 2016 that led you to believe that the behemoth of an elephant that is the monolithic European Union would suddenly become a ballerina twirling on a sixpence and able to adapt with the flexibility that you hoped?
I mean, you're right, obviously, to say that the EU isn't, possibly characterised by by its sort of fleetness of foot in the way it deals with third countries. But we did hope, and I think have reason to expect, and still do have reason to expect, that in the very special context of Northern Ireland, they would see things differently. After all, that was the very reason we had to agree a protocol and special arrangements in the first place. And I think we felt that after 3 or 4 years of negotiation, it was pretty clear that we were dealing with a sensitive and delicately balanced situation in Northern Ireland, and there would be some responsiveness to that. And to be fair, I'm not saying there's been no responsiveness, merely that we're not there yet and we haven't found the right balance to deal with it.
Okay, I mean, yours and my experience of the European Union would suggest that hope against a legalistic monster that is the Court of Justice and various other EU institutions is certainly an ambitious way to proceed.
It is possibly ambitious, but we are hoping and were hoping and still hope to have a kind of constructive relationship with the EU more broadly. And we saw this as a big part of it, and we still hope we can get there. I think, as I've said before, I think the EU does need to try and find a way of dealing with big third countries in its neighbourhood that is a bit more responsive and sort of fleet of foot, and isn't about a kind of cookie cutter approach fitting everything in the same template.
I think that's very aspirational, but I'll now hand over to Royston Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. You covered a bit of what I wanted to talk about, but I will ask Lord Frost, if I may, what did you learn about the EU as a negotiator at your time, or from your time at UK Rep and as the FCDO Director for Europe?
Gosh, one interesting question. I could probably give a more interesting answer if I had time to sort of think about it. So I think, a couple of propositions, I suppose. I think it's different negotiating as a member state to negotiating with the EU as a third party. That's very clear. And I think one of the problems perhaps with the process before this government took over was that we hadn't fully internalised that difference. The things I took from it were, from my experience, are one, sort of say what you mean. Don't sort of say things you don't mean or aren't prepared to deliver on. Make sure your words are sort of mean something when you say them, and people can react to them. Don't restrict what you can ask for through conventional thinking. Part of what I think the EU is actually quite good at responding to almost any proposition if you give it time to sort of think about it and absorb it and work through it internally. So getting people used to what you need to get as a solution is a big part of the process, and I've written a bit separately about this in the past. So I think being honest, being clear, not restricting what you want to fit in with a sort of perceived perception of the other side, but to be clear about what's in the national interest and ask for it, I think it's certainly some things I'd take from it, but hopefully one day I'll write a book on the subject.
And from your experience, do you find that the negotiators on the other side of the table, the EU negotiators, would behave in a similar way? Do they say what they mean? Do they ask for what they wanted, or were they are they more opaque in what they in the way they negotiate?
I think the difficulty the EU have, they've got obviously incredibly professional and skilled negotiators, and the whole EU is kind of negotiating machine, so that's not that surprising really. I think the problem they have with third countries, and it comes back to what I was saying earlier, is that obviously they have positions which are to a large extent set for them by the internal debate in the EU, and quite often in law, not just as a political proposition, and that can restrict their kind of room for manoeuvre. So, I think it's a common experience of third countries negotiating with the EU to feel this, that there's a set of things that are to some extent take it or leave it, and that is perhaps one of the reasons why the EU finds it harder to do free trade agreements with third countries than it would like, that it sort of ties its own hands. So they're very professional, and within those frameworks, I would say incredibly creative, but their backdrop is different to that of a single member state.
That makes sense. Chairman, just one more if I may, and that's about the issues about the protocol dominating the recent G7 summit, and what impact do you think that will have on UK's foreign relations, and how would you characterise the American position and what you're doing to avoid a negative impact on other areas of our UK-US cooperation?
So I think on the US side of it, obviously, the Prime Minister was clear about this over the weekend at the G7, that obviously they touched on it in their conversation with the President, and agreed that protecting the Good Friday Agreement is the most important thing, and that is absolutely what we're all trying to do. So I don't think there's any difference between us on that. We're very happy to talk about our view of the protocol to anybody who wants to talk about it with us. And it obviously came up in some of the conversations with Europeans at the G7, and the Prime Minister was very clear about how things needed to change if we were going to find the right balance. But as I say, I think it's always better to be clear with people so they can internalize it and react to it, and that's where we were.
Do you think that the Americans fully understand it from our position, particularly, but in general? And do you think that that it will, get in the way of our future relationship, negotiations with them going forward?
So I wouldn't comment on how another country understands this.
Please do. I mean, if you could just.
No. I know. I'm sure people would like me to, but I think obviously Ireland is very much debated in Washington, as are many other issues, and we talk honestly and frankly to the Americans as our closest ally about that and lots of other things, and we don't have a problem with that. And as I said, we don't have a problem with talking to anybody else either about this issue. We believe our views are well-founded and well-grounded and are very persuasive.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll have to wait for the book to get the unabridged version.
You can read the other half in French at the moment. Barnier has published his version. Henry Smith, you wanted to come in, and then Bob.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Good morning, Lord Frost. And yes, if I can get a signed copy when that's available, that would be appreciated. Obviously, Gibraltar left the EU last year at the same time that the United Kingdom did. And of course, there are ongoing negotiations with Spain on border issues. I think you were being recently quoted as saying that in talks, there are several issues yet to be fleshed out. What are those issues, and how difficult do you expect negotiations with Madrid and the EU to be, and what sort of timescale are we looking at?
So this is one of the issues where this is a Foreign Office lead, because Foreign Office responsibilities for the overseas territories more broadly. So, I mean, obviously we are closely involved in the processes, but it's an FCDO team who takes this forward. I'll ask Lindsay to sort of comment in a moment in that sort of spirit, as he works for both of us. But where we are at the moment is that, as we understand it, unless something has changed very, very recently, we are still waiting for the formal mandate to be agreed through the EU processes, so they can begin the formal negotiations for us. Obviously, at the moment, we're operating as regards Gibraltar on the basis of the sort of political understanding that was reached right at the end of last year, and that now needs to be formalised. I think we'd like it to have gone a bit quicker, possibly, than it has, but these things are often more complicated than you think and take longer. But we're ready to go when the EU is ready. But I'll ask Lindsay if she has more details to add on that.
Thank you, Lord Frost. I would just add that I think that the political agreement at the end of last year between us and Spain provides actually a very strong basis for the negotiation. That was agreed between the Foreign Secretary and the Spanish Foreign Minister. What it does is provides a framework. So it's absolutely true that there is quite a lot of complexity around movement of people, and it's a special arrangement which obviously needs to work with the EU's Schengen system for people. Similarly, there are quite complex issues around the way the goods relationship would work. Those, I think, are the two big areas of the agreement that we'll take working through via the mandate, which we would expect the EU to produce before the summer break. But I think that the spirit between the UK, the government of Gibraltar, and Spain on this remains extremely positive. and the relationships that have underpinned it, in particular, the sort of determination of all parties to build an area of shared prosperity around Gibraltar and the Campo de Gibraltar, as the Spanish call the area.
Chairman, if I may, one further question on this issue. Obviously, we've been speaking about issues with the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. As far as EU alignment of rules is concerned in the Gibraltar context, do you see any similar issues? And on free movement of people and Schengen, any progress with regards to possibly the Cordoba corridors at Gibraltar Airport being a solution to that?
Can I turn to Lindsay again on that, if that's okay, Joe?
Yes. So on the people work, then it's actually rather a different context and rather a different solution than was envisaged originally in the Cordoba agreement, because the context has changed with it being an external EU frontier. So we are instead looking at a solution which fully opens the whole of the border area rather than just having a corridor through the airport. In terms of whether there are parallels with other situations, whether in Northern Ireland or elsewhere, I would say that I think the EU recognises that the situation in Gibraltar is rather distinctive, as the situation in other situations where we found agreements.
I'm afraid the connection to Brussels seems to be as poor as some of the negotiations. Henry, have you concluded?
I think for the purposes of time and technology, I have.
Thank you. Bob, over to you, and then straight on to Stuart afterwards.
Thanks, Tom. Have we got the connection back, by the way? Or is Lindsay no longer with us?
I think we're trying to get it back, but I think he isn't now.
I suppose it's more of a political question. So anyway, hello, Lord Frost. I'm just going to sort of develop a little bit, if I may, just what Chris and Royston were talking about. And clearly, if you read the newspapers in this country, there's a debate in the European Union about individual countries' attitude towards us. So the French seemingly, according to some of the media, still want to punish us and seem to have learnt nothing from the last 100 years of European history. The Germans and the Dutch seem to be keener to move on and develop a positive relationship. How does the division between EU nations over how to treat us help or hinder your negotiations? And what is the Commission's how does the Commission balance these competing interests, whether to be hostile to us on principle because of Brexit to punish us, or whether to move on and to provide actually a useful working relationship for the nations and peoples of the European Union and the UK?
So I could talk probably on that subject for hours, but we'll not do so. I think I do think it's probably too simplistic to say that some want to punish us and some want to move on. I think it's more complicated than that. I actually think a lot of what we're seeing is sort of it's not quite teething troubles. It's definitely settling down. There's been a big change in the relationship, and lots of things have changed very rapidly, and everybody is kind of adjusting to that, and so are businesses and stakeholders and so on. And obviously that impacts more on some countries than others, and we're seeing that play out. And I think we just got to let that play out to some extent and sort of manage it as responsible international actors should, and I think we're seeing that happen. But I think it's reasonable to think it will be a little bumpy for some time because of that. I said last week at a speech at another event that I think we would have been, those who campaigned for leave would have been surprised to think that the relationship was as sort of relatively difficult as it is now. It's not something that we want. We do think the sooner we can move beyond the settling down process, the better. but we probably have to let it work through. I think the Commission, obviously, to respond to your question about sort of internal workings of the EU on that, they obviously have to balance these different interests. It's their job to be the guardian of the treaties they've agreed to, and they pursue that, in an appropriately prioritised way, just as we do.
But Lord Frost, okay, then I understand the complexities of this, and clearly you don't be drawn because one can talk forever about it. Who is the biggest, or which nation or entity is the biggest stumbling block to that better relationship? Is it, what we see in the papers, the French, or is it the Commission, because they are having to interpret and try to keep the rules of the EU that they've developed? So where is that stumbling block? And is the Commission arguably much maligned in this country, but not necessarily the biggest problem?
So again, I think it's hard to generalize. I think, if you look at, I think the issue with France is that, we have a huge amount of interest with France because of where they are, and because, they're the EU's other main global player. And, we have a lot of positive interest with France. A lot of our goods move through the customs border at French ports. There's fishing, there's the question of small boats, there's a lot. And so I think the issue with France is not sort of goodwill or ill will. I think that I'd like to think there is goodwill, but there are a lot of things in the relationship, and some of them are quite difficult to manage day to day, and that plays itself out. I think the Commission are managing this sort of constructively, by and large, and doing what they have to implement the treaties. I do think, if I have one criticism, perhaps it is that, as I've said before, that sometimes it feels like the resort to threats is a bit quick, and we don't make threats in quite the same way as I think some players in the EU do. And I think if we could just sort of dial that down a bit, it would help.
One final question. Would you like us to be less dependent on French ports for import and export? And does that give the French undue influence with which to threaten us, either seriously threaten or to play silly political games in the run-up to their presidential elections next year?
So I think this isn't really a question about, it's only in part about France. I think, this country should maximise the assets it's got, with a large coastline, big maritime interests, lots of ports that are not Dover and Eurotunnel, and maximise the benefits of that. Obviously, there's a particular framework around Eurotunnel and Dover, which we respect, obviously. But strategically, this country should be a global country and should try and develop a port and infrastructure and export and import arrangements that reflect that, I would say.
So slightly less reliance on the Frenchies.
Okay, that might be one of the consequences of such policy.
Okay, we'll move on from that, acknowledging my declared interest of having a wife working at the French embassy at the moment. Stuart, you're on.
Thanks, Chair. There's a lot I would love to come back to, Lord Frost, perhaps when you come back to the committee in future, but I do want to focus on two issues, if I might, Chair. The first one is around, how does the UK help shape rules, particularly thinking of emerging technologies, cryptocurrencies, artificial intelligence, disruptive technologies, where the EU is a major rule setter on our doorstep. It's working closer and closer, if not in concert with the US, on a lot of the rules and regulations around this. What's your strategy for ensuring that the UK can help shape these rules and isn't left to one side?
So obviously we're just beginning that process. That's clear. But I think there are two things I would say. First of all, the traditional influencing task remains very important via MIS, via embassies in the member states, via our own contacts as ministers, and it is really important that, particularly at the technical level, we spot things that are happening upstream and shape and influence as best we can. And that's a very traditional diplomatic task. And I think the FCDO and their embassies are very good at doing it. It is obviously different when you're outside the setup to when you're in it, but equally you're not bound by the results.
It's harder. It's harder, is it not? It's not just different, it's more difficult.
It's you have to use different tools, I would say. Equally, we're not bound by the results. So I think the trade-off is a different one. I think the
when you say, Lord Frost, we're not bound by the results, do you mean by that if the if the EU sets a standard on new standards on data policy or whatever it might be, somehow we are not going to be impacted or bound by whatever those rules are? I mean, that's surely an absurd view.
Well, I don't think it's absurd. I think we're not part of the EU legal framework, so we're not bound by those rules. Clearly, sort of everything that happens in the world has some influence on us in some way. So we're all connected in that sense, but some things influence us more than others, and not being part of the legal framework is clearly a different situation. But the other answer I'd like to give to your question is that I think another way we are going to influence is by acting ourselves. I mean, it's sort of commonly said that the EU is quite slow at responding to new technologies, to changing its rules, to learning from mistakes that it's made.
Who benefits if we act by ourselves and not in concert with major rule setters, other like-minded liberal democracies like those in the European continent? China, Russia?
It depends what the policy area you're talking about is. Sometimes it'll make sense for us to go with European rules. Sometimes it'll make sense for us to go with American rules. Sometimes it'll make sense for us to act ourselves because we are the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world, and what we do matters. If we set up faster than the EU better regulatory frameworks in new emerging areas, then I would expect that would influence the EU as well. And I very much believe in the sort of regulatory competition and learning from each other as a way forward. And I think one of the problems with the EU is that it's squeezed out that over the years. And that is why we have often said that the UK not being part of the EU legal structure could actually be an advantage for the EU in some ways, as it's forced to compete and challenge itself.
I'd love to challenge some of that, but I'm very conscious of the time. And I do want to very quickly ask you about defence and security cooperation. You were almost the national security advisor. Why do we not have a comprehensive security and defence treaty with the EU?
So there obviously is a comprehensive defence alliance, which includes most, if not all, EU member states and others, which is NATO, and that's the fundamental arrangement for our security. That's the cornerstone. It's just been renewed, obviously, at the summit last week. It is our view that we can have extremely close cooperation with the EU in all kinds of sort of foreign policy and security and defence areas without having a formal treaty relationship with it. And I think so far that's been borne out. Obviously, we look at areas like EDF and PESCO and EDA, but at the moment, the terms for third country membership don't seem quite right. And that is...
So the terms for PESCO seem to be okay for the US, they seem to be okay for Canada. What does the UK not like about the terms?
So I think we are, again, this is an issue that's perhaps more for other ministers than me, but we have some concerns about the rules for third countries, restrictions on use of IP and export controls, for example. Every country takes its own view about the right trade-offs for it in such agreements like that. And, some countries may come to different views about that, but at the moment we think the trade-offs don't quite suit us. But we keep all these things under review. I don't think we have a sort of ideological position about this as a third country. As you say, some third countries do have relations. It's a question of do the benefits outweigh the potential costs.
And can I ask you finally, Chair, the government has ruled out notifying Parliament in advance if it chooses to join any PESCO projects. Who made that decision, and what's the thinking behind it, and how on earth does that help make Parliament more sovereign?
So I wouldn't want to comment on that. That in particular aspect is not my direct responsibility. I personally find it difficult to imagine that we could take decisions like that without quite a lot of debate around it. And I think that's just a reality of the situation. But as I say, it's not my direct responsibility, and I want to sort of be correct about that.
It might have been if you'd become the National Security Advisor. So would you have advised the government to tell Parliament if it was going to join a PESCO project on, say, military mobility?
So I wouldn't like to.
I would like you to.
I would like to answer hypothetical questions about my evanescent tenure as National Security Advisor.
Thank you, Chair.
Can I bring in Andrew Rossendale, please, who has some questions for you?
Good morning, Lord Frost. Can you see me okay? I'm sorry, I'm on my iPhone rather than on a laptop. So
you're side on, but we can hear you, Andrew. So speak up, and we'll work with it.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, Lord Frost. 2 or 3 very short points I'd like to make and ask for your reaction. First of all, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, said at the time of the signing of the Northern Ireland Protocol, the agreement at the time, that it was a, quote, cracking deal for Northern Ireland. You may remember him saying that. Was that correct in light of what's happened since?
So I think it was a deal that could have been cracking, as it were, when that statement was made. I don't remember it precisely when it was made, but you know, we felt that we had a deal that balanced the different requirements, supported the Good Friday Agreement, respected the sensitivities and the delicacies of Northern Ireland, and crucially brought an element of consent and voting into, you know, whether it was sustained in the future. As we say, it's not, you know, we don't feel the balance that we hope for is quite there in real life, but there's time to do something about that.
You say there's time to do something about that, but Lord Frost, surely all British people, all British citizens are entitled to be treated the same and to be equal within Her Majesty's realm, and that is not happening. You have a difference in the way you're treating the people of Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the United Kingdom. How is that sustainable for a Conservative and Unionist Party government?
So as I said, I think you know, we did something pretty exceptional with this protocol, and you know, we recognised it was quite an unusual situation, and that's why we did what the previous negotiating team had not, which is bring an element of democracy into these arrangements and make the whole thing sustainable with a vote in the Assembly. And that's why we continue to say, you know, we feel that such an unusual arrangement can only work if there is general consent and it is sort of accepted as legitimate by everybody in Northern Ireland. And obviously the problem at the moment is that doesn't appear to be the situation that prevails, and that's why we have some of these problems.
But surely you're not intending to wait 4 or 5 years to have this looked at again by the Northern Assembly. Surely the government, our own British government, needs to preempt this more urgently and find an alternative way forward, perhaps ending the protocol completely and opening what most countries have in the world is bilateral relations with their neighbour. So intensify the bilateral relations with Dublin and work closely with our friends in Ireland, rather than persisting with this failed protocol, which is treating one group of British people differently than another and dividing our United Kingdom?
So, as I say, we're considering all our options. The current situation is not satisfactory, and it's hard to see how it can be sustained. I think, and as I said, some of the timetables are now relatively short, a lot shorter than the 4 years, as you say. I think nevertheless, the fact of a treaty commitment to a vote in 4 years, and indeed, the protocol ends unless sustained in 4 years' time. That changes the politics around it hugely. It makes it very clear that, even if that formal event only happens in 4 years, the whole thing is based on consent. If it isn't acceptable to all communities in Northern Ireland, it's very difficult to make it work. And unfortunately, that's the situation that we're in at the moment, and that's why we keep saying, as currently operated, it's hard to see how you can sustain it.
One final question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Lord Frost, the United Kingdom has a responsibility not just to the people of the United Kingdom, but to the people of the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies. We seem to have pretty much failed to ensure that they were all fully included as equal parts of the British family during these negotiations. We now have a situation whereby the Falkland Islands fisheries are not treated in the same way as they were before. We're having issues with France, in which they're making threats against Jersey, and Gibraltar has already been referred to by one of my colleagues, Henry Smith. Again, they seem to have been hung out to dry. Instead of this all being resolved at the same time as the rest of the UK, surely we have responsibility to them to stand by them and include them fully in any agreement. Why wasn't that done? Why was this all left with so many loose ends when really we have a responsibility to have defended and looked after those territories and dependencies?
So, Mr. Rosendale, I think that deserves a sort of full answer for which there isn't time, because we're already running over time a bit. But I think, just to answer it very briefly, Gibraltar we've talked about. Overseas territories obviously were not part of the EU in the first place, but did have access to the EU for trade, and the EU would not extend those arrangements, unfortunately, and that's why we're in the situation that we are in. Obviously, we are supporting the OTs on whom this has an effect, notably the Falkland Islands because of the squid trade. In a very supportive way. So that's the situation there. Crown dependencies are covered in the treaty to some extent, where it is of direct interest to them, most obviously goods and fisheries. And I think the action that we took in May shows that we are standing by them. And we support their right to regulate their fishing territories as set out in the treaty, and we will continue to do so. So we are doing our level best to be as supportive as we possibly can of those territories. Chair, I will have to go in a few minutes. But,
I do understand. Can we wrap up very quickly?
Yeah.
And first of all, may I just ask, just a very quick question, as somebody who's been negotiating on behalf of Her Majesty's government in various different guises now for, I'd say now well over 30 years, if I'm not aging you too much, probably about that, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Have you ever heard of any other trade negotiation which has negotiated away control of a sovereign part of a kingdom?
I couldn't say that I'm familiar with absolutely every negotiation that's been done by every country. I don't agree that's what we did in this negotiation. If you're referring to Northern Ireland, the protocol is very clear about the territorial integrity of the UK and Northern Ireland's position as part of the customs union and the single market of the UK. I don't deny that we did something very special and unusual, and we did it for good reasons, and we hoped that it would work, but at the moment it is not working particularly well.
Okay. And may I just follow up with a couple of bilateral questions, which is very briefly,
Shall I come in on those?
we're really just closing up, Claudia. So go on, one question if you want to, but very quickly.
Well, I know we've run out of time, but I just want to ask this question. The government is clearly seeking bilateral agreements with individual EU countries to build on the arrangements in terms of the UK-EU deal. What are its priorities, and with which countries in that regard?
So again, it requires a sort of fuller answer probably, but obviously, despite the reach of the EU treaties over the years, there is some still bilateral competence left to member states in various areas, and areas like visas, areas like aviation, aspects of sort of law enforcement, returns agreements for refugees, and so on, are some of the areas that are of close interest to us. We talked about the musicians and touring performers earlier, so those sort of areas are the areas where we'd like to sort of pursue and see what can be done. And we think that's sort of reasonable. I don't think it distracts from the the overriding task of making the main agreements work. It simply reflects the fact that the EU itself is an organisation of multi-layered competences, and we have to work with that if we're going to achieve what we want to achieve.
Lord Frost, can I can I first of all thank you, Mr. Appleby and Mr. Taylor, and finally thank you, Lord Frost, for the generosity of your time. I do understand we've overrun very slightly, for which I apologise, but you've been extremely gracious in coming forward with your answers. May I, however, say that, as you yourself admitted, you are pretty much the Europe Minister, covering such an important relationship at such an important time that really does, as you know, from your time in Carvis Bay only recently, fundamentally affect other relationships like that with Australia, the United States and Japan. And so I will, if I may, press you to return to this committee, because you are so influential in British foreign policy today, and your decisions really are shaping foreign policy beyond the continent of Europe. So I would urge you to come back, as your importance knows no limits.
I think you're very over gracious, if I may say so, Chair, on that. But I certainly don't exclude it. You made some good points, and lots of select committees would like to see me, and I have to be realistic about it. But I think the points are well made.
Thank you very much indeed. And on that note, may I thank everybody for supporting this session. Order, order.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.